Hey dreamers, tonight we're exploring the beginning of one of mythology's most fascinating stories. What happens when a goddess grows up in a world where every decision of the gods can reshape destiny? What early event sets Demeter on the path that will define her forever? And what hidden moment in her childhood changes everything? Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video if these journeys bring you a little closer to rest. It's always a pleasure to see our community of listeners, so let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Let's travel back then. Not just back in time, but back beyond time itself. Back to a moment when the world was still being written by the hands of the Titans. We're going to the very beginning of Demeter's existence, a beginning that involves less of a gentle birth and more of what we might charitably call a complicated family situation. Because in Greek mythology, even the most powerful goddesses have to deal with dysfunction. The only difference is that their dysfunction has cosmic consequences. Picture this, the golden age of the Titans, when Cronus ruled over all creation from his throne in the heavens. Cronus was not your typical father figure. In fact, he might be what happens when you combine an overachieving perfectionist with the emotional maturity of someone who's been traumatized by a prophecy. You see, Cronus had learned from his own father, Uranus, that chaos comes to those who let their children run wild. So Cronus decided to prevent any rebellion before it could even start. His solution? Swallow his children whole. Now, you might think that such a plan was as elegant as it was unnecessarily complicated. That's the signature move of divine project management, really. Why solve a problem once when you could create an entirely different crisis instead? This is where Rhea enters the story. She was the Titaness queen, goddess of fertility and motherhood. Imagine the frustration of being the embodiment of creation itself, only to have your mate deal with paternity by turning your children into a living storage system. Rhea was not just beautiful, she was wise, and she had watched as Cronus methodically swallowed each of their children one by one. Hestia went first, then came Demeter, then Hera, Poseidon, and finally Hades. 5 divine siblings, gone or rather alive but imprisoned within their father's stomach. Now, Demeter's birth itself was extraordinary. On the day she entered the world, the heavens seemed to rejoice. Flowers bloomed in impossible colours across the meadows of Mount Olympus. The air itself seemed perfumed with jasmine and rose, and the very earth hummed with a strange, gentle energy. This wasn't accidental. This was Demeter's essential nature expressing itself even at the moment of her birth. She was the goddess of the earth, the grain, the seasons, and the harvest, even before she knew what that meant. But her moment of innocent arrival was brief. Almost immediately, Cronus was there, his mouth opening wide, his divine hunger awakening. In those final moments before she disappeared into the darkness of her father's body, Demeter experienced something that would shape her forever. She felt the weight of inevitability. She felt powerlessness. She felt the strange, suffocating awareness that even a god could be swallowed whole by the forces of fate and fear. Inside Cronus's belly, Demeter existed in a strange liminal space. It wasn't death, but it wasn't life either. It was suspension. It was the void. Imagine being conscious, alive, aware, but completely enclosed. Imagine the darkness, the pressure, the absolute stillness. For Demeter, this was her childhood. This was her early existence alongside her siblings. They were there with her in that divine stomach. Hestia, Hera, Poseidon, and Hades, all of them trapped in an endless darkness together. Time moved differently in such a place. Were they asleep? Were they dreaming? Were they awake but unable to move? The mythology is intentionally vague here, almost merciful in its lack of specifics. What we know is that they existed in a state beyond normal experience, beyond pain, but also beyond growth, beyond learning, beyond the natural progression of becoming. But even this strange imprisonment couldn't last forever. The universe has a way of correcting itself, of finding balance and justice through unexpected means. Enter Zeus, the youngest of the Titan children. Zeus had escaped Cronus's appetite through one of those divine flukes that you'd think was too convenient if it wasn't so perfectly on brand for mythology. Rhea, desperate to save at least one of her children, had given Cronus a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. The foolish Titan swallowed it without hesitation, which speaks volumes about divine intellect, honestly. He swallowed what he thought was his youngest son without even the basic courtesy of a second glance. Meanwhile, Zeus was hidden away in a cave on the island of Crete. Picture this place, a cave so ancient that it seemed to have always existed. Inside, the walls were smooth and cool, and there was a curious kind of magic in the air. The sound of running water echoed through the chambers. Nymphs, divine beings of nature herself, came and went like spirits of the forest. They brought ambrosia and nectar, the food of gods, to nourish the young Zeus as he grew in secret. Here's something delicious to contemplate. While Zeus was growing in strength and power, completely unknown to his father, Cronus continued his rule, confident in his absolute dominion. He never once checked to see if his plan was working, never once questioned whether the stone he'd swallowed might be, well, a stone. The confidence of the gods, particularly when they're also the paranoid ones, is almost pitiful. Years passed this way. Zeus grew from an infant into a magnificent god. His power increased with every breath. His divine essence expanded like a star burning in the darkness. Meanwhile, Demeter and her siblings remained in their prison, unaware that rescue was coming, unaware that their youngest brother, the one they'd never even known, was preparing to wage war against the very foundation of creation. Does anyone else find it fascinating how the most important events in our lives often happen completely without our knowledge? Sometimes I wonder if Demeter, suspended in that darkness, had any sense of the world above. Did she feel tremors in the earth? Did she somehow know on an instinctive level that something was shifting? I'd love to know your thoughts on that. Have you ever experienced a moment where you felt a change coming before you understood what it was? For me, it's always that strange feeling in the air before a thunderstorm. There's something in the pressure, the humidity, the very way the light changes. I imagine Demeter might have felt something similar. When Zeus finally came of age, he knew exactly what needed to be done. He'd learned from Rhea herself about his siblings, about their imprisonment, about the cosmic injustice of their situation. He devised a plan to free them. This plan would require cunning, strength, and more than a little bit of divine trickery. It would ultimately lead to the Titanomachy, the war between the Titans and the Olympians, a conflict that would reshape the entire cosmos. Zeus's first step was to find a way to make his father regurgitate. He sought out Metis, the goddess of wisdom and cunning, and asked for her help. Metis was brilliant, and she agreed to aid him. She created a special draught, a potion of such potency that it would force Cronus to disgorge everything he'd consumed. Some versions of the story suggest it was a honey drink laced with magical herbs. Others describe it as something far more mysterious, made from substances that existed at the very edge of reality itself. When the moment came, Zeus served this draught to his father under the guise of a simple gesture of filial respect. Can you imagine? The audacity? Cronus, never one to suspect treachery from someone he didn't even know existed, drank it without hesitation. And then, dramatically, catastrophically, messily, he began to vomit. Everything came pouring out. First the stone came up, followed by Hades, then Poseidon, then Hera, then Demeter, and finally Hestia. They emerged in reverse order from their consumption, each of them suddenly exposed to the light and air of the world for what might have been the first time in their existence. The moment of emergence was profound and disorienting. Imagine being in absolute darkness, in complete stillness, for what might have been years or decades or even longer. Then suddenly you're spilled out into the light, gasping, confused, barely aware of what's happening to your own body. Demeter would have felt the shock of sensory overload, light so bright it seemed to burn, air so fresh it tasted almost painful, sounds so loud they seemed to vibrate through her divine essence. She would have seen her siblings for the first time, really seen them emerging alongside her. She would have looked down at her own divine form and realized what she was, not a prisoner anymore. Not trapped, but also not yet aware of who she would become. This was her true birth, not the moment she left Rhea's body, but the moment she left Cronus's belly and drew a free breath. The other Olympians she was now meeting for the first time were equally stunned. Hestia, the eldest of the siblings who had just been freed, emerged first among them, though she'd actually been born first. She would have carried that strange weight of seniority without any of the memory that should accompany it. Hera was there, destined to become queen of the gods, though none of them knew it yet. Poseidon, who would rule the seas, emerged into the light with the power of the oceans already humming in his veins. Hades, often forgotten and underappreciated, came into this world with the weight of what would become his terrible kingdom already shadowing his future. And then there was Zeus himself, the brother they'd never known, the architect of their liberation. These 5 imprisoned siblings were meeting their youngest brother for the first time at the exact moment of their freedom. The emotional weight of such a moment is almost impossible to adequately describe. How do you even begin to process that? Your entire existence has been one of imprisonment, and suddenly you're free because of someone you've never met, someone from a lineage so separated from your own that they might as well be a stranger. But there was no time for long reunions or family therapy. Cronus, enraged by his betrayal, had already begun preparing for war. He gathered the other titans, those who hadn't been swallowed or stored away, and prepared to defend his supremacy. He would not surrender his throne without a battle of cosmic proportions. The freed Olympians had only just emerged from their prison, and now they were thrust into the role of warriors and rebels against their own father. Here's what makes this part of the story so utterly fascinating. Demeter and her siblings had to grow up overnight. One moment they were experiencing their first breath of free air. The next moment they were taking their place in a hierarchy that none of them fully understood yet. They were given divine assignments almost immediately. Hestia became the goddess of the hearth. Hera was fashioned to be queen and queen maker. Poseidon was given dominion over the waters. Hades received the underworld, a gift that's not quite as glamorous as it sounds. And Demeter? She was given the earth itself, the growing things, the seasons, the sacred trust of fertility and harvest. It's somewhat remarkable, actually, how quickly everyone settled into these roles. It's as if there was something in the divine structure of the cosmos itself that assigned each of them their place. Or perhaps it's simpler than that. Perhaps each of them simply recognized in their own essence what they had always been meant to do. Demeter, more than any of them, seemed to understand this instinctively. The earth called to her. The growing things knew her name before she even learned to speak it. During those early days of freedom, before the full weight of war consumed them all, Demeter would have explored this new world with wonder and curiosity. She would have felt the earth beneath her feet and known, somehow, that this was where she belonged. She would have tasted the first crops and understood that she was their keeper. She would have watched the seasons turn and realized that these cycles were hers to command. But this freedom was still fragile, still new, still unearned in a sense. The Titanomachy was coming. War was coming. The cosmos would soon be torn apart by conflict as the Titans and Olympians struggled for supremacy. And when that war finally came, Demeter would have to choose her side, take her place among her siblings, and fight against her own father. Family loyalty in ancient mythology was complicated, to say the very least. Let me ask you something. How do you imagine you'd feel in Demeter's place? You've just been freed from imprisonment. You've just met your family. You've just discovered who you are, what you are. And suddenly you're being told that you have to go to war against your own father. For me, I think the most striking part of that would be the betrayal Cronus must have felt. He imprisoned his children out of fear, out of paranoia, out of his own trauma. And now those children were going to rise up against him. It's almost tragic if we're being honest. Almost tragic enough to make you forget that he deserved it. Almost. As we trace this path from Demeter's imprisonment to her emergence into the world, we're seeing the fundamental pattern that will define her entire existence. She is born. She is trapped. She is freed. And in that freedom she discovers her purpose. But her freedom comes at a cost. It comes with responsibility. It comes with the knowledge that peace is never permanent and that even the gods must fight for what matters to them. But here's where the story becomes less about cosmic wars and more about something infinitely more intimate, something that might seem almost mundane by comparison, but which is, in truth, far more radical. Because after the Titanomachy ended, after the dust settled and the new order of Olympus was established, Demeter did something that no other god had truly done before. She turned her attention to humanity. Let me ask you something. When you think about the gods of Olympus, what comes to mind? Zeus hurling lightning bolts? Poseidon commanding the seas? Athena strategizing battles? These are grand, dramatic displays of power. They're the kind of divine intervention that makes for spectacular storytelling. But Demeter taught mortals how to plant seeds. I know. It doesn't sound quite as thrilling, does it? But here's the thing. While Zeus was busy with his affairs and Poseidon was creating storms, Demeter was doing something far more revolutionary. She was ensuring that humanity could survive. She was transforming nomadic hunter-gatherers into settled agricultural communities. She was, quite literally, changing the entire trajectory of human civilization. No pressure. Think about what the world looked like before agriculture. Humanity wandered. They followed animal herds. They foraged for whatever they could find. Life was uncertain, precarious, dictated entirely by the whims of nature and the availability of wild food sources. One bad season, one failed hunt, one drought, and entire communities could starve. There was no planning for the future because the future was entirely unpredictable. Demeter looked at this situation and decided to intervene, not with lightning, not with earthquakes, but with knowledge, with patience, with the slow, steady work of teaching mortals how to work with the earth rather than simply taking from it. The gift she offered was deceptively simple, the cultivation of grain. Wheat and barley, specifically. These weren't just any plants, they were transformative, they could be stored. They could be preserved through winter. They could feed entire communities for months, even years, if properly managed. They were the foundation of civilization itself. But before humanity could benefit from this gift, they needed to understand it. And understanding agriculture, truly understanding it, requires a completely different way of thinking about the world. It requires planning. It requires patience. It requires faith in cycles you can't immediately see. This is where Demeter's role becomes truly fascinating. She didn't just hand mortals a bag of seeds and wish them luck. She became their teacher, their guide, their divine mentor in the art of cultivation. She taught them the sacred rhythms of planting and harvest. She showed them how to read the seasons, how to prepare the soil, how to sow seeds at the right time and in the right way. Imagine being one of those first mortals, standing in a field with this goddess, this divine being who embodied the very fertility of the earth itself. She would have shown them how to turn the soil, breaking up the hard ground to make it receptive to seeds. She would have demonstrated the proper depth for planting, the spacing between rows, the techniques for irrigation. These weren't abstract lessons. These were practical, hands-on demonstrations that would determine whether communities lived or died. And here's what I find particularly beautiful about this. Demeter didn't do this from a distance. She didn't issue divine proclamations from Mount Olympus. She got her hands dirty, literally. The goddess of the harvest understood that this knowledge had to be transferred through experience, through demonstration, through the kind of intimate teaching that can only happen when you're working side by side with someone. The mythology tells us that she appeared to mortals in various forms during this period, sometimes as a wise older woman, sometimes in her full divine glory. But always she was teaching. Always she was guiding. Always she was ensuring that humanity understood not just the mechanics of agriculture, but its sacred significance. Because here's the thing about agriculture that Demeter understood better than anyone. It's not just a technological advancement, it's a spiritual practice. It's a way of entering into partnership with the earth itself. When you plant a seed, you're performing an act of faith. You're trusting that the earth will nourish that seed, that the rains will come, that the sun will shine, that the cycles will continue as they always have. Demeter taught mortals to see this cycle as sacred. The planting season became a time of hope and anticipation. The growing season became a period of careful tending and watchful waiting. The harvest became a celebration of abundance and gratitude, and the fallow season, that period when the fields lay empty and dormant, became a time of rest and renewal. Have you ever planted something and watched it grow? I'm talking about really watched it, checked on it daily, noted every new leaf, worried about it during dry spells, celebrated when it finally produced fruit or flowers. There's something profound about that relationship. You become invested in this living thing in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. You start to understand that you're not in control of the process, you're just a participant. The plant does the growing, the earth does the nourishing. You're just there to facilitate, to support, to hope. That's what Demeter was teaching humanity, not dominion over nature, but partnership with it, not control, but cooperation. And in learning this lesson, mortals were learning something even more fundamental. They were learning how to build civilizations. Because here's what happens when you have a stable food supply. You can stay in one place. You can build permanent structures. You can develop specialized skills because not everyone needs to spend all their time searching for food. You can create art, music, literature, philosophy. You can have children and raise them in communities. You can plan for futures that extend beyond the next meal, the next season, the next year. XD Demeter's gift of agriculture was really a gift of time. Time to think, time to create, time to become something more than just survivors struggling against an indifferent wilderness. The specific crops she championed, wheat and barley, became the foundation of the Greek diet. Bread made from grain was called the gift of Demeter by the ancient Greeks. And it wasn't just poetic language, it was literal truth. Every loaf of bread was a reminder of her presence, her power, her ongoing relationship with humanity. But Demeter's domain extended beyond just grain. She presided over all crops, all cultivated plants, all the growing things that humans coaxed from the earth. Fruit orchards fell under her protection. Vegetable gardens flourished under her blessing. Even the practices of animal husbandry, particularly pig farming, which was closely associated with agricultural communities, came under her divine oversight. The farmers of ancient Greece understood this intimately. Before they planted, they made offerings to Demeter. Before they harvested, they thanked her. When the crops were plentiful, they celebrated her generosity, and when the harvests failed, well, we'll get to that. But let's stay in this moment of abundance for now. Picture the Rarian plain near Eleusis, which was said to be the first place where Demeter taught agriculture. This wasn't just any field. This was sacred ground, the original site of humanity's transformation from wanderers to farmers. The soil there was said to be particularly fertile, blessed by the goddess herself. 80. It's in this place that Demeter performed one of her most significant acts, the instruction of Triptolemus. Now, Triptolemus was a prince of Eleusis, and depending on which version of the myth you follow, he was either a young man or a child when Demeter encountered him. What matters is what she chose to do with him. She didn't just teach him agriculture for his own benefit, or even for the benefit of his community. She trained him to be her ambassador, her representative, her missionary of cultivation. She gave him a chariot drawn by dragons, because even practical gods know how to make an entrance, and sent him out across the known world with a mission: teach humanity how to cultivate grain. Can we appreciate how radical this is? A goddess actively spreading practical knowledge to all of humanity, not just to a chosen few. Not keeping the secrets of agriculture locked away as divine mysteries, but deliberately ensuring that every community, every society, every people group had access to this life-changing information. Triptolemus travelled far and wide, carrying seeds and knowledge. He taught kings and commoners alike. He demonstrated the techniques Demeter had shown him: the ploughing, the sowing, the harvesting, the storage. And everywhere he went, communities were transformed. Nomads became settlers. Hunter-gatherers became farmers. Survival became sustainability. This wasn't just practical education. This was the establishment of what the Greeks called thesmoi, sacred customs and laws. Demeter was often called thesmophoros, which means bringer of customs or lawgiver. And this makes perfect sense when you think about it. Agriculture requires rules. It requires social organization. It requires property rights and harvest schedules and communal cooperation. You can't have agriculture without some form of social order. Who owns which field? When is the communal harvest? How is the grain distributed? What happens to those who can't farm their own land? These aren't just practical questions, they're ethical ones, legal ones, questions that form the very foundation of civilization. Demeter, in teaching agriculture, was teaching humanity how to live together in organized societies. She was establishing the basic principles of communal life, of social justice, of the sacred responsibility that communities have to ensure that everyone has access to food. This is why she was associated with peace, with law, with the kind of stable social order that allows civilizations to flourish. Think about what this means. The goddess of the harvest is also the goddess of social order. The deity who makes the wheat grow is also the deity who establishes the rules for how that wheat should be distributed. There's a profound philosophical statement embedded in this connection, that justice and abundance are inseparable, that you can't have one without the other. The ancient Greeks understood this in their bones. Their entire civilization was built on the cultivation of grain. Their economy depended on it. Their social structures were organized around it. Their calendar was marked by the agricultural seasons: planting time, growing time, harvest time, fallow time. And at every stage of this cycle, Demeter was present. Her divine essence permeated the entire process, The farmers felt her in the soil beneath their feet. They saw her in the green shoots emerging from the earth. They recognized her in the golden waves of grain ready for harvest. They honored her in the bread on their tables. This wasn't abstract theology. This was lived religion, practical spirituality woven into the daily work of survival and sustenance. Every act of farming was an act of worship. Every harvest was a miracle. Every meal was a sacrament. But, and here's where things get complicated, Demeter's power wasn't just creative, it was also destructive, or perhaps more accurately, her power was conditional. The abundance she offered came with an implicit understanding. Humanity needed to maintain right relationship with the earth and with the goddess herself. Key: when Demeter was pleased, when she was honoured and respected, the earth flourished. Crops grew in abundance, harvests were plentiful, communities thrived. But when she was displeased, when her sacred groves were violated, when her gifts were taken for granted, when the natural order was disrupted, she could withdraw her blessings with devastating consequences. The most famous example of this, of course, would come later with the abduction of her daughter Persephone. But even before that defining tragedy, the Greeks understood that Demeter's favour was not something to be assumed. It had to be earned, maintained, honoured through proper ritual and respect. There's a lesser-known myth that illustrates this perfectly, the story of Erysichthon. This man, a king in some versions, decided to cut down a sacred grove of trees that belonged to Demeter. The trees themselves cried out as they were felled, but Erysichthon ignored their pleas. He dismissed the warnings of his servants who reminded him that these were the goddess's trees. He scoffed at the idea that a goddess would care about a few trees. Demeter's response was both creative and terrible. She cursed him with insatiable hunger. No matter how much he ate, he could never feel full. He consumed everything in his household. He sold all his possessions to buy more food. Eventually, he even sold his own daughter into slavery to feed his endless appetite. And still, he hungered. The myth ends with him consuming himself, driven mad by a hunger that could never be satisfied. It's a brutal story, but it makes the point clearly: Demeter's gifts come with responsibilities. The earth's abundance is not infinite, not unconditional, not something that can be taken without consequences. Respect the sacred, honor the source, maintain balance, or face the consequences. Have you ever thought about how relevant this message is? How our own relationship with agriculture and the earth has become increasingly disconnected, increasingly extractive, increasingly unsustainable. Sometimes I wonder what Demeter would think of modern industrial farming, of the way we treat soil as a commodity rather than a sacred trust. But I digress. The point is that ancient Greeks understood something we've perhaps forgotten, that agriculture isn't just a technology. It's a relationship, and like all relationships, it requires reciprocity, respect, and careful tending. This is why Demeter's worship involved such elaborate rituals and festivals. The most famous of these were the Eleusinian Mysteries, which we'll explore more deeply later. But there were others too. The Themaphoria, for instance, a festival celebrated exclusively by women, which involved rituals designed to ensure the fertility of both the earth and the community. The Spearhew Four claimed. These weren't just quaint traditions. They were essential practices, ways of maintaining right relationship with the divine forces that made life possible. The women who celebrated the Themaphoria understood that their fertility and the earth's fertility were connected, that the goddess who made the wheat grow was the same force that allowed human life to continue. And here's something fascinating. While most Greek religious festivals were dominated by men, Demeter's worship often centered women's participation. Women led many of her rituals. Women maintained her sacred spaces. Women taught the mysteries associated with her cult. This makes perfect sense when you think about it. Demeter was fundamentally a goddess of fertility, of cycles, of the profound mysteries of life emerging from darkness into light. These were experiences that women understood in their own bodies, the cycles of menstruation, the mystery of pregnancy, the transformation of childbirth. There was a natural alignment between women's experiences and Demeter's domain. But this wasn't just about symbolism. Women in ancient Greece were often responsible for processing grain, for baking bread, for managing the food stores that kept households alive through winter. They had an intimate daily relationship with Demeter's gifts. They ground the grain, they kneaded the dough, they tended the ovens. They literally transformed the goddess's bounty into the sustenance that kept their families alive. In this way, every woman who baked bread was performing a sacred act, participating in Demeter's ongoing work of nourishing humanity. The distinction between domestic labor and religious ritual blurred. The kitchen became a temple. The hearth became an altar. Now, let's talk about Demeter's symbols, because they tell us so much about how the ancient Greeks understood her. The most prominent symbol was the sheaf of wheat, simple, practical, immediately recognizable. Not a lightning bolt, not a trident, just wheat, just the most basic, essential crop that kept civilization alive. She was also depicted with the cornucopia, the horn of plenty overflowing with fruits and grains. This symbol represented not just abundance, but the kind of extravagant, generous abundance that comes when the earth is properly honored and tended. It's a reminder that Demeter's gifts weren't meant to be merely sufficient. They were meant to be abundant, joyful, more than enough. And then there's the torch. This symbol is more mysterious, more complex. The torch represented Demeter's search for her daughter, yes, but it also represented illumination, knowledge, the bringing of light into darkness. It represented her role as teacher, as the one who showed humanity the way forward. These symbols weren't arbitrary. They were carefully chosen to represent different aspects of Demeter's multifaceted nature. She was the practical provider of grain. She was the generous giver of abundance. She was the illuminating teacher of sacred knowledge. In artwork and sculpture, Demeter was typically portrayed as a mature woman, not a young maiden, not an ancient crone, but a woman in the fullness of her power and wisdom. She often wore a veil, which signified her connection to the mysteries, to the sacred knowledge that couldn't be fully revealed. She carried herself with dignity, with authority, with the quiet confidence of someone who knows her own power. This representation mattered. In a pantheon filled with youthful gods and goddesses celebrated for their beauty and passion, Demeter stood apart. She was maternal, but not diminished by that role. She was powerful, but not aggressive. She was essential, but not flashy. She was, in many ways, the most genuinely revolutionary deity in the entire Greek pantheon. Because here's what Demeter represented that the other gods didn't: the absolute necessity of the mundane. Zeus could hurl all the lightning bolts he wanted, but people still needed to eat. Athena could strategize all the battles she wanted, but armies marched on their stomachs. Aphrodite could inspire all the passion she wanted, but passion doesn't fill empty bellies. Demeter was the goddess who made daily life possible. She was the deity you couldn't ignore because ignoring her meant starvation. She was power incarnate, not through dramatic displays of force, but through quiet, steady, absolutely essential work. And I think that's worth contemplating for a moment. In our own lives, what are the Demeter forces? The quiet, essential, often underappreciated work that makes everything else possible. For me, it's always the people doing the necessary but invisible work. The farmers, the food service workers, the people who maintain infrastructure and supply chains. They're rarely celebrated. They're often taken for granted. But without them, everything collapses. Just like without Demeter, all of Olympus's glory meant nothing. The ancient Greeks got this. They understood that Demeter wasn't just another deity to add to the pantheon. She was foundational. She was essential. She was the goddess you honored first, before all others, because without her blessings, nothing else mattered. This is why, when we talk about Demeter as the goddess of Earth's fertility, we're talking about something far more profound than agricultural productivity. We're talking about the divine force that made civilization possible. We're talking about the bridge between wilderness and culture, between survival and flourishing, between merely existing and truly living. Demeter taught humanity how to create abundance from the earth. But more than that, she taught humanity how to recognize that abundance as sacred, how to honor the source of life, how to maintain the delicate balance between taking and giving back. She taught that the earth's fertility wasn't something to be exploited, but something to be partnered with, respected, honored. And in doing so, she established the template for all agricultural societies that would follow. The rhythms she taught, planting and harvest, growth and rest, abundance and fallow, became the rhythms of civilization itself. The festivals in her honor marked the turning of seasons. The rituals dedicated to her ensured communal cohesion. The mysteries associated with her name offered hope of continued life beyond death. So when we picture Demeter in those early days after the Titanomachy, walking among mortals and teaching them the sacred art of agriculture, we should see her as she truly was, not just a goddess of grain, but the architect of human civilization as we know it. Every city, every empire, every complex society that would ever exist, all of it built on the foundation she laid when she showed that first mortal how to plant a seed and trust in the earth's capacity to nurture it into abundance. But now we come to the part of the story that transforms everything. Because all of Demeter's power, all of her divine authority over the earth's fertility, all of her essential work in establishing human civilization, none of it mattered as much to her as one thing, one relationship, one bond that defined her existence more than any other aspect of her divinity. From Mundi, her daughter Persephone, portrayed as, let me ask you something. When you think about the most important relationship in your life, what comes to mind? For some of you, it might be a partner, a parent, a friend, a child. But whatever that relationship is, you know the feeling I'm talking about, that sense that this person is somehow fundamental to who you are, that their well-being is inseparable from your own, that you would move mountains, shake the foundations of reality itself, if it meant protecting them. That's what Persephone was to Demeter. Not just her daughter, not just another relationship. She was the emotional core, the beating heart, the reason behind everything. The ancient Greeks understood this so deeply that they had a special name for Demeter and Persephone together. They called them the two goddesses, not individually named, but referred to as a unit, an inseparable pair whose bond was so profound it transcended individual identity. Think about that for a moment. In a pantheon filled with individualistic, ego-driven deities constantly asserting their own importance, here were two goddesses whose relationship was considered more significant than either of them alone. Even Demeter's own name contains this maternal essence. The ancient Greek word for mother, meter, is literally embedded in her name. She wasn't just a mother. She was motherhood itself, the divine embodiment of that primal, protective, all-consuming love that defines the maternal bond. Now, Persephone's birth itself is worth examining, though the myths give us several contradictory versions. In the most commonly accepted version, she was the daughter of Demeter and Zeus. Yes, Zeus, Demeter's own brother. Because in Greek mythology, family trees don't branch so much as loop back on themselves in ways that would make a modern genealogist weep. But let's not get too distracted by the problematic family dynamics of Olympus. What matters is what happened after Persephone was born. Because from that moment on, Demeter's existence was fundamentally altered. She had given birth to someone she loved more than the earth itself, more than the harvest, more than her own divine power. Picture the early years of their relationship. Demeter, the goddess of fertility and agriculture, raising a daughter who embodied springtime, growth, and renewal. Persephone wasn't just any child. She was radiant, beautiful, in a way that made flowers bloom when she walked past them. Her very presence brought vitality to everything around her. The two of them were inseparable. When Demeter went to tend the fields, Persephone would come along, playing in nearby meadows while her mother worked among the crops. Can you picture it? The goddess of the harvest, hands in the earth, coaxing abundance from the soil, while her daughter danced through fields of wild flowers, her laughter carrying on the wind like music. There's something almost unbearably tender about this image. For all of Demeter's cosmic power, for all her importance to the survival of humanity, what she treasured most were these simple moments with her daughter. Not grand divine gatherings on Olympus, not elaborate festivals in her honor, just the quiet joy of being together, of watching her daughter grow, of sharing the beauty of the natural world they both embodied. And here's what's particularly fascinating. When Demeter and Persephone were together, the seasons didn't change. It was eternal spring and summer, endless growth and abundance. The earth flourished perpetually because both goddesses were present, both contributing their unique essence to the world. Demeter provided the foundational fertility, the power of the earth itself. Persephone brought the renewal, the fresh growth, the vital energy of youth and beginning. Their relationship wasn't just emotionally significant, it was cosmologically significant. The universe itself responded to their unity. When they were together, creation flourished, life burgeoned, the world existed in a state of perpetual abundance. But of course, this couldn't last. Because in Greek mythology, happiness is always temporary, and the gods have a particular talent for destroying beautiful things. 2. Enter Hades, the god of the underworld, ruler of the dead, Zeus's brother, and therefore Persephone's uncle, again with the family complications. Hades had been ruling his dark kingdom alone, surrounded by the dead, existing in the shadows beneath the earth. And one day he saw Persephone. Now, different versions of the myth describe this moment in different ways. Some say he glimpsed her from beneath the earth and was instantly struck by her beauty and vitality. Others say he emerged from a volcano on Sicily, where Demeter and Persephone happened to be, and saw her there among the flowers. But all versions agree on one thing: Hades wanted her. And being a god accustomed to taking what he wanted, he decided to make her his queen. But here's where the story gets complicated in ways that echo through centuries of interpretation and reinterpretation. Because Hades didn't court Persephone, he didn't ask Demeter's permission, he didn't even ask Persephone herself. Instead, he went to Zeus. Zeus, who was both Persephone's father and Demeter's brother. Zeus, who apparently thought he had the right to decide his daughter's fate without consulting either the daughter in question or her mother. Zeus, who, in a decision that would have catastrophic consequences, gave Hades permission to take Persephone as his bride. Let me pause here to let that sink in. The king of the gods, in a private conversation with the god of the underworld, decided the fate of a young goddess without involving her in the decision at all. Without even informing her mother, who had raised her, loved her, built her entire existence around her. The ancient Greeks had a word for what happened next. They called it harpaga, abduction, seizure, rape. The English translations often soften this to abduction or kidnapping, but the original word carried connotations of violent seizure, of taking by force what was not freely given. So there's Persephone, picking flowers in a meadow. Some versions of the myth say she was specifically attracted to a narcissus flower of impossible beauty, planted there by Zeus himself as a trap. As she reached for it, the earth split open beneath her feet. Up from that chasm came Hades in his chariot, drawn by immortal horses, and he grabbed her. Imagine the terror of that moment. 1 second you're in a peaceful meadow on a beautiful day picking flowers. The next second the ground is literally opening beneath you. A strange god is dragging you into a chariot, and you're being pulled down, down, down into the darkness of the earth. Persephone screamed. The myths are very clear about this. She cried out for her mother. Her voice echoed across the meadows, carried on the wind, a desperate plea for help that Demeter, working in distant fields, didn't hear in time. And just like that, she was gone, taken into the underworld, swallowed by the earth, separated from everything and everyone she had ever known. Now imagine Demeter's experience of this moment. She's working, perhaps humming to herself, thinking about her daughter playing nearby. The sun is shining, the crops are growing. Everything is as it should be. And then, nothing. Just an inexplicable sense that something has shifted, that something is terribly, fundamentally wrong. She calls for Persephone. No answer. She searches the meadow where her daughter was supposed to be playing. Empty. Just flowers swaying in the breeze, giving no indication of the violence that had just occurred there. The myths tell us that Demeter searched everywhere. She abandoned her divine duties completely. The harvest, the crops, the fertility of the earth, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was finding her daughter. She wandered the earth for 9 days and 9 nights, without rest, without food, without stopping. She carried torches to light her way in the darkness. This is why torches became one of her sacred symbols. She asked everyone she encountered, gods, mortals, nymphs, anyone who might have seen what happened. But no one would tell her the truth. Either they didn't know, or they were afraid to reveal Zeus's complicity in the abduction. Can you imagine the desperation? The mother of fertility, the goddess of abundance, reduced to wandering the world like a refugee, calling out her daughter's name, pleading for any scrap of information, any clue to where Persephone might be. Have you ever lost someone? I don't necessarily mean death, though that certainly counts. I mean that desperate, frantic feeling when someone you love is suddenly not where they're supposed to be, and you don't know where they are or if they're safe. That moment when your mind spirals through every terrible possibility, when every second feels like an eternity, when nothing else in the entire world matters except finding them. That's what Demeter was experiencing, but magnified to cosmic proportions. During this search, something interesting happened to Demeter. The grief transformed her. The myths describe her disguising herself as an old woman, hiding her divine radiance. It's as if the loss of Persephone had stripped away her divine identity, reduced her to the most fundamental aspect of herself. Not a goddess, not the power behind agriculture, just a mother who had lost her child. Finally, on the 10th day, Helios, the sun god who sees everything from his position in the sky, took pity on her and revealed the truth. Hades had taken Persephone to the underworld, and Zeus, her own brother, Persephone's father, had given his permission. The revelation was devastating on multiple levels. Not only had her daughter been violently abducted, but the crime had been sanctioned by the highest authority in the cosmos. There was no justice to appeal to. The king of the gods himself had authorized this violation. Demeter's response was absolute. If Zeus thought he could separate her from her daughter, if he thought he could make decisions about Persephone's life without her consent, if he thought divine authority superseded maternal love, well, he was about to learn otherwise. She withdrew her blessings from the earth entirely, not in anger exactly, or not just in anger, in grief, in a sorrow so profound that it radiated out from her and affected all of creation. The crops stopped growing, the seeds refused to sprout, the earth became barren, lifeless, cold. For the first time in human history, winter arrived. Not the gentle dormancy of fallow fields, but a deathly stillness, a complete absence of growth or life. And Demeter did nothing to stop it. She didn't care. What was the harvest compared to her daughter? What did human survival matter when Persephone was trapped in the land of the dead? This is where Demeter's power becomes fully apparent, because it turns out that all of Zeus's lightning bolts meant nothing if people were starving. All of Olympus's glory was irrelevant if humanity, the very beings who worshipped the gods and gave them meaning, was dying out. The mortals cried out to the gods for help. They made offerings, performed sacrifices, begged for relief. But Demeter would not relent. She had one demand, simple and absolute: return my daughter. Phile, the other gods began to pressure Zeus. This couldn't continue. The cosmic order was collapsing. Humanity was on the brink of extinction. Something had to be done. Zeus, faced with the consequences of his own actions, finally sent Hermes, the messenger god, down to the underworld with a command for Hades: return Persephone to her mother. But here's where the story takes another turn, one that reveals layers of complexity about Persephone's own experience that we sometimes forget when we focus solely on Demeter's grief. Because Persephone had been in the underworld for months at this point, she had been Hades' queen, and depending on which version of the myth you read, her feelings about this were complicated. Some versions suggest she was traumatized, desperate to escape, counting the days until someone would rescue her. Other versions hint at something more nuanced, that she had adapted to her new role, that she had found a kind of power in the underworld, that her relationship with Hades had evolved into something more complex than simple captor and captive. The myth tells us that when Hermes arrived with Zeus's command, Hades knew he had to obey. But he also knew that if Persephone returned to the upper world without any tie to the underworld, he would lose her forever. So he did something that would change the cosmos permanently. He gave her pomegranate seeds to eat. In Greek mythology, there was an absolute rule. Anyone who consumed food in the underworld was bound to that realm. They could not fully return to the land of the living. It was the ultimate binding contract, sealed not with signatures but with consumption. The number of seeds varies depending on the version. Sometimes it's 4, sometimes 6, sometimes 7. But the principle remains the same. Persephone ate the seeds, and in doing so, she bound herself to the underworld. Did Hades force the seeds on her? Did he trick her? Did she eat them knowingly, understanding the consequences? Different versions of the myth give different answers, and honestly, that ambiguity is part of what makes this story so endlessly fascinating. When Persephone returned to the upper world and reunited with her mother, the joy was immeasurable. Demeter, seeing her daughter alive and returned to her, immediately restored her blessings to the earth. Spring burst forth with unprecedented abundance. Flowers bloomed everywhere. The crops grew with renewed vigor. Life returned to the world. But the reunion was bittersweet. Because of those pomegranate seeds, Persephone could not stay with her mother permanently. A compromise was struck, some say by Zeus, others say it was a negotiation between Demeter and Hades themselves. For part of each year, Persephone would live with her mother in the upper world. For the rest, she would return to the underworld as Hades' queen. Apollo duration varies in different tellings. Some say it was 4 months in the underworld for 4 seeds eaten. Others say 6 months for 6 seeds, half the year above, half below. But the pattern was established, and it would repeat forever. And this is how the Greeks explained the seasons. When Persephone is with Demeter, the goddess's joy causes spring and summer to flourish. The earth blooms, crops grow, life abounds. But when Persephone must return to the underworld, Demeter's sorrow causes autumn and winter. The earth goes dormant, plants die back, cold and darkness prevail. It's a beautiful explanation for seasonal change, but it's also something much deeper. It's a meditation on the nature of love, loss, and the cycles of life itself. Think about what this myth is really saying. It's saying that some separations are inevitable, that loss and reunion are part of the fundamental rhythm of existence. That love doesn't prevent pain, it actually makes pain possible because you only grieve what you love. Demeter's love for Persephone is so profound that it literally shapes the world. Her joy creates abundance, her sorrow creates desolation. The entire cosmos bends to the force of maternal love. But here's what I find most powerful about this story. Demeter never accepts the separation as right or just. Every year when Persephone must return to the underworld, Demeter grieves as if it's happening for the first time. She doesn't get used to it, she doesn't make peace with it, she mourns, and that mourning manifests as winter. There's something deeply honest about this. How often are we told to get over our losses, to move on, to accept things that feel fundamentally unacceptable? Demeter refuses. Every single year, she insists on her grief. She claims her right to mourn, and the world accommodates her sorrow, provides space for it, acknowledges that some losses deserve ongoing grief. At the same time, she never loses hope. Every spring, when Persephone returns, Demeter's joy is as fresh and powerful as if her daughter had been gone forever and had miraculously returned. She doesn't hold back her happiness because she knows another separation is coming. She celebrates the reunion fully, completely, with her whole divine essence. This is the rhythm of their relationship. Absolute joy in union, absolute sorrow in separation, and the eternal cycle between the two. Neither emotion is diminished by its inevitable end. Neither experience is less real because it will change. They live fully in each moment, whether that moment is one of togetherness or apartness. And Persephone herself. She becomes something unique in the pantheon. She is both the maiden of spring and the queen of the dead. She embodies life and death, growth and decay, beginning and ending. She moves between worlds, belonging fully to neither, or perhaps more accurately, belonging fully to both. Her annual descent into the underworld and return to the upper world mirrors the cycle of seeds planted in the earth, buried in darkness, seemingly dead, but carrying within them the potential for new life. When she emerges each spring, she brings with her the promise of renewal, the knowledge that death is not the end, but a transformation. This dual nature makes Persephone arguably one of the most complex and profound figures in Greek mythology. She's not just a victim of divine politics, she's not just her mother's daughter or Hades' wife. She's a bridge between realms, a goddess who understands both light and darkness, who has experienced both freedom and captivity, who knows both the joy of spring meadows and the somber weight of ruling the dead. And, crucially, her relationship with her mother remains the emotional constant throughout all these transformations. No matter how much power she gains in the underworld, no matter how complex her relationship with Hades becomes, no matter how many souls she judges or seasons she oversees, when she sees her mother again each spring, she's still Demeter's daughter. The myths tell us that their reunions are tender, joyful, filled with the kind of intimacy that can only exist between two people who know each other completely. They walk together through fields, they share stories, they simply exist in each other's presence, renewing the bond that defines both of them. This bond, this two goddesses relationship, became the foundation of the Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most important and enduring religious traditions in all of ancient Greece. These secret rites, which we'll explore in more depth later, centered entirely on Demeter and Persephone's story, on their separation and reunion, on the mysteries of death and rebirth that their relationship embodied. Initiates into the mysteries were promised a better afterlife, not through avoiding death, but through understanding it as part of a cycle, just as Persephone descends into death each year but always returns. The message was profound. Death is real, loss is real, suffering is real, but they're not the end of the story. There is always the possibility of return, renewal, transformation. And at the heart of this promise was a mother's love that refused to accept her daughter's permanent death, that shook the foundations of the cosmos until a compromise was reached, that insisted, against all divine authority, that love matters more than power. I think about this story a lot, about what it means that the Greeks made seasonal change, not the result of orbital mechanics or atmospheric conditions, but the consequence of a mother's emotional state. They looked at the world and decided that the most powerful force in the cosmos wasn't Zeus's lightning, or Poseidon's earthquakes, or Ares's warfare. It was Demeter's love for her daughter. Pointed. When Persephone is home, the world is beautiful. When she's away, the world grieves. The entire planet exists in sympathy with a mother's heart. That's the bond between Demeter and Persephone. Not just a relationship, but a force of nature. Not just an emotion, but a cosmic principle. Not just love, but the kind of love that literally shapes reality itself. Now we arrive at the moment that changes everything. The moment that transforms Demeter from the benevolent goddess of abundance into something far more primal, far more dangerous. The moment when she discovers that divine power means nothing if you can't protect the one you love most. Let's set the scene properly, because context matters here. Sicily, or depending on which version you're reading, various locations across Greece, in a time when the world still existed in eternal spring. The earth was perpetually abundant because both Demeter and Persephone walked upon it, their combined presence ensuring endless growth, endless renewal, endless life. Persephone had gone out to pick flowers, such a simple, innocent activity, the kind of thing she'd probably done countless times before. She was with the Oceanides ocean nymphs who served as her companions and attendants. They were laughing, gathering blossoms, enjoying the kind of perfect day that only exists in mythology, when the world hasn't yet learned about tragedy. But this day was different, because someone watching. Hades, lord of the underworld, king of the dead. Zeus's older brother, Persephone's uncle, and a god who had spent countless ages ruling his dark kingdom in isolation. He lived beneath the earth, surrounded by the souls of the deceased, presiding over a realm that was necessary but grim, essential but unloved. And he was lonely. Profoundly, devastatingly lonely in a way that only someone who rules death can understand. Every other god had companions, lovers, families. Hades had shadows and silence. Then he saw Persephone. How exactly he glimpsed her from his underground realm varies by telling. Some versions say he emerged from beneath the earth and caught sight of her dancing through the fields. Others suggest he saw her through a crack in the earth's surface, her radiance penetrating even into his dark domain. But all versions agree he wanted her. Not in the gentle, respectful way of courtship, not with consideration for her own desires or her mother's feelings. He simply decided she would be his. Now, here's where the story gets particularly disturbing, particularly revealing about the power dynamics of Olympus. Because Hades didn't storm off and immediately abduct Persephone. No, he did something worse. He asked permission. He went to Zeus, his brother, Persephone's father, the king of the gods, and he essentially said, "I want your daughter to be my wife and queen of the underworld." And Zeus, who was supposed to protect his children, who was supposed to uphold justice, who styled himself as the supreme arbiter of divine law, said yes. Let that sink in for a moment. Two male gods, in a private conversation, decided the fate of a goddess without involving her at all. They didn't ask Persephone what she wanted. They certainly didn't consult Demeter, who had raised Persephone, who had devoted herself entirely to her daughter's well-being. Zeus gave his permission. More than that, he actively helped plan the abduction. Some versions say he even created a special flower, a narcissus of impossible beauty, specifically to lure Persephone away from her companions. A trap, designed by her own father. Can you imagine the betrayal implicit in that? Your own father conspiring in your abduction? It's the kind of violation that echoes through generations, the kind of wound that never fully heals. So there's Persephone, picking flowers with her companions, and she sees it, this narcissus, more beautiful than any flower that has ever existed. It seems to glow with an inner light. It calls to her, irresistible. She reaches for it. Her fingers close around the stem, and at that exact moment the earth splits open beneath her feet. The sound must have been incredible. The thunderous crack of the earth literally tearing apart, the rumble of underground caverns suddenly exposed to daylight. Her companions would have screamed, stumbled back from the widening chasm. And up from that chasm came Hades, in his chariot drawn by immortal black horses. Some versions describe the chariot itself as made of gold, a bitter irony, this beautiful, precious thing being used for such a violent purpose. Persephone screamed. The myths are very explicit about this. She cried out for her mother, for her father, for anyone who might help her. She fought. She resisted. This was not a willing journey. Sequel. But what could she do against a god who had already decided her fate? Hades grabbed her, physically seized her, and pulled her into the chariot. The myths use the Greek word harpaga, which doesn't just mean abduction, it means violent seizure. It means rape. The ancient Greeks understood exactly what kind of violation this was. The earth closed back up behind them. Just like that. One moment Persephone was in the sunlight, surrounded by friends, picking flowers. The next moment she was being dragged into absolute darkness, into the realm of the dead, by a god she hadn't chosen, didn't want, couldn't escape. Her companions stood there in shock, staring at the ground that had just swallowed their friend. The flowers she'd been holding lay scattered on the grass. The narcissus, that cursed beautiful trap, still swayed in the breeze. Only two beings had actually witnessed what happened. Hecate, goddess of magic and crossroads, heard Persephone's screams from her cave. And Helios, the sun god, saw everything from his position in the sky. But neither of them intervened, neither of them stopped it. Why would they? Zeus himself had sanctioned this abduction. Who dares oppose the king of the gods? Now picture Demeter, working in distant fields, completely unaware of the catastrophe that had just befallen her daughter. Maybe she was teaching mortals some new agricultural technique. Maybe she was blessing crops. Maybe she was simply enjoying the satisfaction of watching things grow under her care. And then something. A disturbance, a wrongness in the world that she couldn't quite identify but could absolutely feel. The kind of instinct that mothers have, That sixth sense that tells you something is wrong with your child even when you can't see them, can't hear them, have no logical reason to worry. She called for Persephone, no answer. She searched the usual places, the meadows where her daughter loved to play, the groves where she would dance with nymphs, nothing, just an eerie silence where there should have been laughter, life, presence. 2. The panic must have been instantaneous and absolute. One moment your daughter is where she's supposed to be, safe and happy. The next moment, she's simply gone, vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed her, which, of course, it had. Demeter's response was immediate and all-consuming. She abandoned everything, her divine duties on Olympus, irrelevant. The crops and harvests that depended on her attention, meaningless. The mortals who worshipped her, who needed her blessings to survive, they would have to fend for themselves. Because nothing, absolutely nothing mattered except finding Persephone. She grabbed torches to light her way and began to search. For 9 days and 9 nights, she wandered the earth without stopping. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She didn't rest. She simply searched, calling her daughter's name, demanding answers from anyone she encountered. Can you imagine the physical reality of that search? A goddess, driven by grief and terror, ranging across the entire known world, peering into every valley, every forest, every shadowed place where her daughter might be hidden. The torches burning in her hands, illuminating her desperate face, the tears that she couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, because stopping meant accepting that she might never find her child. She asked everyone she met, mortals who cowered before her obvious distress, nymphs who genuinely didn't know what had happened, minor gods and goddesses who either hadn't witnessed the abduction or were too afraid to tell her the truth. Because here's the thing, many of them knew, or at least suspected, divine gossip travels fast, and Zeus's role in the abduction couldn't remain completely secret. But telling Demeter meant admitting that Zeus himself had betrayed her, had essentially sold their daughter to his brother. Who wants to deliver that news? So they stayed silent, or they lied, or they deflected, and Demeter continued her frantic search, growing more desperate, more anguished, more willing to tear the world apart to find her daughter. During this search, something began to happen to Demeter herself. The grief was transforming her, stripping away the outer layers of divinity to reveal something more primal underneath. She disguised herself as an old woman, or perhaps the disguise was simply the visible manifestation of her inner state. She looked haggard, exhausted, aged by sorrow in a way that gods aren't supposed to age. This is important. Demeter, the goddess of abundance and growth, was becoming a figure of desolation and loss. The transformation was visible, physical, impossible to ignore. And as she changed, so did the world around her. Because Demeter's blessings weren't just something she consciously bestowed, they were an expression of her essential nature, her emotional state, her relationship with existence itself. When she was content, when Persephone was with her, the earth flourished automatically, naturally, inevitably. But now she was anything but content. She was shattered, terrified, enraged, grief-stricken beyond measure. And that emotional state began to affect the world just as powerfully as her joy had. The crops began to fail, not dramatically at first, just small things, seeds that didn't quite germinate as vigorously, plants that grew a bit more slowly, harvests that weren't quite as abundant. The kind of changes that farmers notice immediately, but that everyone else might overlook. But it got worse. WAWIS. Finally, on the 10th day of her search, Demeter encountered Helios, the sun god. And either because he took pity on her suffering, or because he couldn't bear to keep the secret any longer, he told her the truth. Hades had taken Persephone to the underworld, and Zeus had given his permission. Imagine receiving that information. Your daughter has been abducted to the realm of the dead by one of the most powerful gods in existence. And your own brother, your daughter's father, not only knew about it, but authorized it. The betrayal was multi-layered, profound, absolute. Zeus hadn't just failed to protect Persephone, he had actively conspired in her abduction. He had chosen his brother's desires over his daughter's safety, over Demeter's right to raise her own child. Demeter's response was visceral and immediate. She was done. Done with Olympus. Done with Zeus. Done with the entire divine hierarchy that could allow something like this to happen. Done with the gods who valued power and politics over basic decency, over family, over the sanctity of a mother's bond with her child. She left Olympus entirely, just walked away from it, renounced her place among the Olympians. If they thought they could function without her, if they thought divine authority mattered more than justice, then let them try. And she withdrew her blessings from the earth completely. This is where the cosmic consequences of the abduction become truly apparent, because Demeter wasn't just refusing to do her job out of spite. She was physically, emotionally, spiritually incapable of nurturing growth while her daughter was imprisoned in the realm of death. How could she make things grow when her own heart was withering? How could she bless the harvest when her own life had been harvested, cut down, destroyed? How could she celebrate abundance when she had lost the most precious thing she possessed? The earth began to die. Not slowly, not gradually, but comprehensively, dramatically, terrifyingly. The crops that were growing in the fields withered and died. New seeds refused to sprout. The trees dropped their leaves. The grass turned brown. Flowers wilted. Even the most hardy plants, the ones that had survived every drought and storm, simply gave up. For the first time in human history, there was winter. But this wasn't the gentle dormancy of nature resting. This was desolation. This was death. The mortals were terrified and confused. They had never experienced anything like this before. They prayed to Demeter, made offerings, performed all the usual rituals. Nothing worked. She wasn't listening, or more accurately, she didn't care. They tried praying to other gods. Zeus, Hera, Apollo, Athena, any deity who might intervene. But what could those gods do? They couldn't make crops grow. That was Demeter's domain, Demeter's power. Without her cooperation, without her blessing, the earth remained barren. As weeks turned to months, the situation became desperate. The stored grain from previous harvests began to run out. Livestock started dying because there was no fodder to feed them. People began to starve. And still Demeter did nothing. She wandered the earth in her grief, disguised as an old woman, watching the devastation spread and feeling nothing but the hollow ache of her daughter's absence. Some versions of the myth say she eventually came to Eleusis, where she was welcomed by a family who didn't recognize her divinity. They offered her hospitality, and she briefly attempted to care for their infant son, even trying to make him immortal as a kind of substitute for the daughter she'd lost. But that's a whole other part of the story. What matters here is the scale of her grief and its consequences, because this wasn't just one woman mourning her child. This was a force of nature, a divine principle refusing to function, and the entire world was feeling the effects. The gods on Olympus were getting nervous. They needed mortal worship, mortal sacrifices, mortal belief. But mortals who were starving to death don't perform elaborate rituals. Mortals who are watching their children die don't build temples. Mortals who are desperate don't have the luxury of piety. Zeus sent messengers to Demeter. "Come back to Olympus," they pleaded. "Resume your duties. The mortals are dying. Her response, in essence, was simple and devastating. Give me back my daughter. They couldn't. She was in the underworld. She was Hades's wife now, or so he claimed. There were rules, cosmic laws, traditions. Bull, Demeter, didn't care about any of it. The standoff continued. The earth continued to wither. Humanity continued to starve, and Demeter remained unmoved, unreachable, locked in a grief so profound that it was literally killing the world. Zeus tried everything. He sent Iris, his messenger goddess. He sent the Charites, goddesses of joy and beauty. He sent goddess after goddess, offering gifts, promising honors, trying to bargain, cajole, threaten. Nothing worked. Demeter had one demand, and one demand only. So, finally, Zeus understood this wasn't going to end until Persephone was returned. His brother's desires, his own decisions, the entire political structure of Olympus, none of it mattered if the alternative was the complete extinction of humanity and the end of divine worship. He sent Hermes, the messenger god who could travel between realms, down to the underworld with a command for Hades, send Persephone back. But by then, something had already happened, something that would make the resolution far more complicated than anyone anticipated. Persephone had eaten pomegranate seeds. Whether Hades forced them on her, tricked her into eating them, or whether she consumed them knowingly, that debate has raged for millennia. But the result was the same. She had eaten food from the underworld, which bound her to that realm according to divine law. She couldn't fully return, not permanently, not completely. And Demeter, when she learned this, must have felt her heart break all over again, because the reunion she'd fought for, the return she demanded, the restoration she believed possible, it would only ever be partial. Her daughter would come back, but she would also have to leave again, forever. An eternal cycle of reunion and separation, joy and sorrow, presence and absence. The abduction of Persephone didn't just rob Demeter of her daughter. It fundamentally altered the nature of their relationship, transformed it from unbroken union into cyclical visitation. It took what was whole and made it fractured. It took what was permanent and made it temporary. And the earth would bear the marks of this tragedy forever. When Persephone returned to her mother, spring would bloom. When she left again for the underworld, winter would descend. Every year, humanity would experience both the joy of Demeter's reunion with her daughter and the sorrow of their separation. The seasons were born from violation, from betrayal, from a mother's inconsolable grief. Every winter is a reminder that some losses never fully heal. Every spring is evidence that love persists despite impossible pain. Demeter never forgave Zeus for his role in the abduction. How could she? He had betrayed both her and their daughter in the most fundamental way possible. He had proven that divine politics mattered more to him than family, that male authority superseded maternal rights, that power trumped love. But she had also proven something equally important, that even Zeus, king of the gods, couldn't function without her cooperation. That the goddess of the harvest held a kind of power that was quieter than lightning bolts but ultimately more essential. That a mother's love could literally reshape the cosmos. The abduction changed everything. It introduced death into a world that had known only life. It brought winter to fields that had known only growth. It taught humanity about loss, about grief, about the ways that violence echoes through generations. But it also taught them about resilience, about the strength required to continue loving despite devastating loss, about the kind of power that refuses to accept the unacceptable, that insists on justice even when the entire divine hierarchy says otherwise. Demeter's grief became winter, But her love, her absolute, unshakable, world-altering love for her daughter, became spring. So now Demeter knew the truth. Her daughter was in the underworld, taken there by Hades with Zeus's blessing. And knowing this changed everything, because before there had been hope, the desperate, irrational hope that maybe Persephone was lost somewhere but still accessible, still recoverable, still within reach. But the underworld? That was different. That was the realm of the dead, a place from which mortals never returned, a kingdom separated from the living world by more than just distance. It was separated by the very nature of existence itself. And Demeter's brother, her own brother, had imprisoned her daughter there. The rage that followed this revelation was absolute and devastating. The myths describe Demeter as filled with anger, with a fury so profound that it manifested physically in the world around her. But I think calling it anger almost diminishes what she was experiencing. This was something deeper, something that encompassed rage but also grief, betrayal, helplessness, and a determination so fierce it could reshape reality itself. She made a decision in that moment. If Zeus thought he could betray her, if the gods thought they could violate her daughter without consequences, if Olympus believed that divine politics superseded maternal love, then Olympus would learn otherwise. She left. Just walked away from the divine realm entirely. She refused to return to her duties, refused to participate in the celestial hierarchy, refused to play her assigned role in the cosmic order. She was done being the obliging goddess who made everything grow, while the male gods made all the decisions. But more than that, and this is where her power becomes truly apparent, she actively withdrew her blessings from the earth. This wasn't passive neglect. This was a deliberate act of divine resistance, a cosmic strike that would force the gods to confront what they had allowed to happen. The seasons halted. All living things ceased their growth and began to die. The earth, which had known nothing but abundance and fertility, became barren and cold. Plants withered in the fields, seeds refused to germinate. Even trees that had stood for centuries began to lose their leaves, their vitality, their very will to live. Dai and Demeter wandered, for 9 days initially, searching desperately for any trace of her daughter. But even after she learned where Persephone was, the wandering continued. Because what else could she do? She couldn't storm the underworld and take her daughter back by force. Not even a goddess of her power could violate the fundamental boundaries between life and death. So she walked the earth in her grief, and the earth died beneath her feet. The myths tell us she disguised herself as an old woman during this time. Some interpretations suggest this was a conscious choice, a way to move among mortals unrecognized. But I think there's something deeper happening here. The disguise wasn't just external, it was a reflection of her inner state. Grief ages us. It strips away everything extraneous until only the essential remains. And what was essential to Demeter in this moment? Not her divine radiance, not her status as an Olympian, not her role as the goddess of agriculture, just the bare fact of being a mother who had lost her child. So she looked like what she felt like, old, exhausted, defeated. A woman who had lost the most precious thing in her world and had been forced to confront the utter powerlessness that comes with such a loss. During her wandering, she encountered countless mortals. Most didn't recognize her divinity through the disguise. They saw only an old woman, grief-stricken and alone, and their responses varied. Some offered kindness, some turned her away, some were indifferent to her suffering. But the earth kept dying, because Demeter's grief wasn't something she could compartmentalize or set aside. It was her entire reality, radiating outward and affecting everything it touched. The mortals began to panic as their crops failed and their stores ran low. They didn't understand what was happening. Agriculture had always worked before. The cycles of planting and harvest had been reliable, predictable, blessed by the goddess Demeter. They prayed to her, made offerings at her temples, performed all the usual rituals of appeasement and worship. But Demeter wasn't listening. Or more accurately, she heard them but didn't care. How could she care about their harvest when her own daughter had been harvested, stolen, dragged into darkness? The other gods began to notice. At first, it was just the agricultural deities, the minor gods and goddesses whose domains intersected with Demeter's. They could feel the wrongness in the world, the way the natural order was breaking down. Then the mortals' prayers reached Olympus, desperate pleas for intervention, for relief, for any explanation of why the goddess of the harvest had abandoned them. Zeus, sitting on his throne, must have begun to realize the scale of what he'd unleashed, because humanity wasn't just struggling, it was dying, and gods need mortals. They need worship, sacrifices, belief. Without humanity, the Olympians would still exist, but their power, their relevance, their very purpose would be fundamentally diminished. He sent messengers to Demeter. "Come back," they pleaded. "Resume your duties. The mortals are starving." Her response was simple and immovable. "Return my daughter." They couldn't. She had eaten food from the underworld pomegranate seeds that bound her to that realm. There were cosmic laws, divine precedents, rules that even Zeus couldn't simply override. Demeter didn't care about the rules. Rules hadn't protected Persephone. Rules hadn't prevented her abduction. Rules were clearly flexible enough to allow Zeus to give his daughter to Hades without her consent, so they could damn well be flexible enough to bring her back. The standoff continued. More messengers came, Iris with her rainbow bridge, various goddesses offering gifts and honors, even some of the more sympathetic Olympians who genuinely wanted to help. But Demeter refused them all. She had one demand, and nothing else mattered. Meanwhile, the mortal world was collapsing. Famine spread across all the lands. People began to die. First, the vulnerable, the very young and very old, then everyone else. Livestock died for lack of fodder. Wild animals began to starve. The entire food chain was breaking down because its foundation plant life itself had ceased to function. It's worth pausing here to appreciate what Demeter was doing. She was holding the entire world hostage to force the gods to right a wrong. She was using the only power she had, her control over fertility and growth, as a weapon against those who had more traditional forms of divine authority. Zeus could throw lightning bolts, but lightning couldn't make crops grow. Poseidon could create earthquakes and tsunamis, but water meant nothing without plants to nourish. Athena could strategize battles, but armies couldn't fight when they were starving. Ares could inspire warfare, but there's no glory in conquest when there's nothing left to conquer. Demeter had found the pressure point of the entire divine hierarchy, and she was pressing on it with all her considerable might. Eventually, in her wandering, she came to Eleusis, a city in Attica, not far from Athens. She was still disguised as an old woman, still carrying the weight of her impossible grief, and at a well later known as the Maiden's Well, she sat down to rest. This is where the story takes a turn towards something more intimate, more human in its scale, even as it remains divine in its implications. The daughters of King Celeus found her there, 4 princesses who saw only an old woman in distress and responded with kindness. They asked who she was, offered her water, invited her to come to their father's palace where surely work could be found for her. Demeter, touched by their genuine compassion, or perhaps simply too exhausted to refuse, agreed. She told them her name was Doso, meaning the giver, which was both a disguise and a truth. She was the giver, the source of all growth and abundance. But in this moment she had nothing to give except her sorrow. The princesses brought her to their mother, Queen Metanira, who was nursing an infant son named Demophoon. The queen, seeing this dignified old woman, offered her a position as the child's nurse. And Demeter accepted. Think about what this means. The goddess of the harvest, whose own daughter had been stolen from her, taking on the care of someone else's child. Was it a distraction from her grief? An attempt to fill the void Persephone had left? Or was it something more complex? A recognition that even in her devastation she still had the capacity to nurture, to protect, to love? She threw herself into caring for Demophoon with an intensity that went beyond normal mothering. The myths tell us she fed him ambrosia during the day and placed him in the fire at night to burn away his mortal nature. She was trying to make him immortal, to gift this human child with the divine immortality that had failed to protect her own daughter from suffering. But one night, Queen Metanira walked in and saw her infant son in the flames. She screamed, which, to be fair, is a reasonable response to seeing your baby in a fire. And Demeter, interrupted in her work, pulled the child from the flames and revealed her true nature. The disguise fell away. The old woman transformed into the radiant goddess, terrible in her divine majesty, terrifying in her grief-fueled power. She chastised Metanira for her interference, explained what she had been trying to do, and told them exactly who she was. The royal family was terrified. They had been harboring the goddess whose anger was killing the world. They had unknowingly become part of a divine drama that was reshaping the cosmos itself. But Demeter, despite everything, had been moved by their kindness. They had taken in a stranger. They had offered hospitality without knowing who she was or what she could give them in return. In a world where the gods had betrayed her, these mortals had shown her simple, uncomplicated compassion. So she made them an offer. "Build me a temple," she said. "Here in Eleusis, construct a sacred space where I can be honored, where my mysteries can be celebrated, where the truth of death and rebirth can be understood." And they did. The people of Eleusis, either out of devotion or terror or gratitude, built a magnificent temple to Demeter. And in that temple, Demeter remained, withdrawn from the world, still refusing to let the earth bloom, still demanding the return of her daughter. But something significant had happened during her time with the royal family of Eleusis. She had begun to transform her personal grief into something larger, something that could offer meaning to others who suffered. The attempt to make Demophoon immortal had failed, but it planted the seeds, if you'll pardon the agricultural metaphor, of what would become the Eleusinian Mysteries. These mysteries, which would eventually become one of the most important and enduring religious traditions in all of ancient Greece, centered entirely on Demeter's experience of loss and eventual reunion with Persephone. They offered initiates the promise of a better afterlife, not through avoiding death, but through understanding it as part of a cycle. Just as Persephone would descend into the underworld each year and return each spring, so too would human souls experience death not as an ending, but as a transformation, a passage to something else. Just as Demeter's grief gave way to joy when her daughter returned, so too would the sorrow of loss eventually give way to reunion, renewal, rebirth. This was revolutionary theology. Most Greek conceptions of the afterlife were bleak. The underworld was a grey, joyless place where souls existed in a kind of shadow life, stripped of vitality and purpose. But the Eleusinian Mysteries promised something different. They promised that initiated souls would have a privileged place in Hades's realm, that understanding the mysteries of Demeter and Persephone would fundamentally alter one's experience of death. We don't know exactly what these mysteries involved. They were secret, sacred, never to be revealed to uninitiated outsiders. People who participated in them kept that secret for centuries, which is remarkable when you think about it. In a world without non-disclosure agreements or legal consequences, thousands of people over hundreds of years kept these rituals genuinely mysterious. But we know they involved reenacting Demeter's search for Persephone in some way. We know they included fasting, purification, sacred dramas and revelations that supposedly transformed the initiate's understanding of life and death. We know that people from all over the Mediterranean world traveled to Eleusis to participate, that these mysteries were considered among the most important religious experiences available. And it all started because Demeter, in her grief and rage, came to Eleusis and was shown kindness by mortals who didn't know who she was. But even as she was establishing the foundations of these sacred traditions, even as she was beginning to transform her personal suffering into collective wisdom, Demeter still refused to relent on her primary demand. The earth remained barren. Humanity continued to starve. The gods continued to panic as their worship and sacrifices dwindled along with the mortal population. Zeus finally understood that this wouldn't end until he gave Demeter what she wanted, or at least some version of what she wanted. Because returning Persephone fully and permanently was now impossible, she had eaten those damned pomegranate seeds. But a compromise could be reached. A deal could be struck. It wouldn't be perfect, it wouldn't undo the violation, but it might be enough to restore the world before everything collapsed entirely. Zeus sent Hermes, the only god who could freely travel between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, down to the underworld with a command for Hades. Not a request, not a suggestion, a command from the king of the gods himself. Send Persephone back, Zeus. And Demeter, still in her temple at Eleusis, still wrapped in her grief and fury, waited. She had weaponized her sorrow, had made the entire world feel the weight of her loss. She had proven that a mother's love could hold the cosmos hostage. Now she would see if it was enough to bring her daughter home. The people of Eleusis watched her, this terrible goddess who had transformed their city into the center of a cosmic drama. They had shown her kindness when she was disguised as a stranger. Now they were witnessing the full scope of her power and her pain. And they understood, perhaps better than the Olympians ever could, that some losses are too great to accept quietly, that some violations demand a response that shakes the foundations of the world. That love, real, deep, uncompromising love, is the most powerful force in existence, capable of destroying civilizations or saving them depending on whether it's honored or betrayed. Demeter's time in Eleusis wasn't just a pause in her search or a side plot in the larger myth. It was the crucible in which her private grief was transformed into collective wisdom, where her personal experience of loss and rage became a template for understanding suffering, death, and the possibility of renewal that humans would study and honor for over 1,000 years. Full, she sat in her temple, surrounded by mortals who had shown her unexpected kindness, and she waited for justice, or at least for whatever approximation of justice the gods could manage. And the earth, held in the grip of her sorrow, waited with her. Hermes descended into the underworld with Zeus's command, and for once divine authority was being wielded in the right direction, not to enable an abduction, but to correct one, or at least to mitigate it, since the damage was already done. Picture Hermes arriving in that shadowy realm, his winged sandals carrying him through the darkness, past the river Styx, past the fields of asphodel where the ordinary dead wandered in their grey half-existence, all the way to the throne room where Hades ruled his grim kingdom. And there, sitting beside him, or perhaps standing apart, we don't really know, was Persephone. What was she feeling in that moment? The myths don't always tell us, which is interesting in itself. We know everything about Demeter's grief, but Persephone's own emotional state during her captivity remains somewhat mysterious. Had she resigned herself to her new role? Had she found some measure of adaptation, some way to survive in circumstances she hadn't chosen? Or was she still the terrified maiden who had screamed for her mother as the earth swallowed her whole? Probably all of those things at once. Trauma is complex like that. You can adapt and still be traumatized. You can find ways to function in impossible circumstances and still desperately want escape. Hermes delivered Zeus's message, "Send her back. The mortals are dying. Demeter refuses to relent. The cosmic order is collapsing. This has gone too far." And Hades. Hades, who had started this whole catastrophe by deciding that what he wanted mattered more than what Persephone wanted, agreed. He had to. Even the Lord of the Underworld answers to Zeus when push comes to shove. But he had one final trick to play. The pomegranate seeds. The myths vary on exactly how this happened. Some say he forced them on Persephone, some say he tricked her, some hint that she ate them knowingly. But the result was the same. She had consumed food from the underworld, and there was an ironclad rule about that. Anyone who ate food in the realm of the dead was bound to that realm. They couldn't fully return to the world of the living. Not permanently, not completely. Was this Hades' insurance policy? His way of guaranteeing that even if Zeus commanded her return, she would still be tied to him, still bound to his kingdom. It's hard to interpret it any other way. Even in releasing her, he was ensuring she couldn't fully escape. The number of seeds matters in some versions. 3, 4, 6, depending on who's telling the story. Each seed representing a month that Persephone would have to spend in the underworld. It's the kind of magical contract that Greek mythology loved, binding, specific, impossible to break. So Persephone began her journey back to the surface world, back to the light, back to her mother. Can you imagine what that ascent must have felt like? After months in darkness, surrounded by the dead, living in the absolute stillness of the underworld, suddenly moving upward, toward life, toward sunshine, toward everything she'd lost. And Demeter, waiting in her temple at Eleusis, felt something change. Maybe it was that maternal intuition again, that same sixth sense that had told her something was wrong when Persephone was first taken. But this time, it was telling her something was right. Her daughter was returning. The reunion is described in the myths with a tenderness that's unusual for Greek mythology. These stories tend to focus on grand gestures, on battles and transformations and dramatic confrontations. But the moment when Demeter and Persephone saw each other again, that moment is portrayed with genuine emotion. They embraced. They wept. They held each other as if they would never let go. And for that moment, all of Demeter's rage and grief dissolved into pure joy. Her daughter was alive. Her daughter was home. Nothing else mattered. The earth responded immediately. Flowers bloomed with impossible speed, bursting from ground that had been barren moments before. Trees that had lost their leaves suddenly flourished with new growth. Seeds that had lain dormant in the cold earth suddenly sprouted. The entire world came alive again, responding to Demeter's joy just as it had responded to her sorrow. Spring had arrived for the first time in human history. Not the endless, unchanging spring-summer that had existed before Persephone's abduction, but something new. The explosive renewal after death, the celebration of return after absence, the triumph of life reasserting itself after being suppressed. But then came the revelation that tempered Demeter's joy. Persephone had eaten pomegranate seeds in the underworld. She was bound to return there. Imagine the gut punch of that realization. You've just been reunited with your daughter after months of searching, months of grief so profound it killed the world. And almost immediately you learn that this reunion isn't permanent, that she'll have to go back, that you'll lose her again and again and again forever. A different person might have broken entirely at that news, might have collapsed back into the despair that had consumed them during the separation. But Demeter had fought too hard to give up now. A bargain was struck. A compromise was negotiated, though who exactly negotiated it varies by version. Some say Zeus imposed the terms. Others suggest it was worked out between Demeter and Hades themselves, perhaps with various other gods mediating. But the terms were clear. Persephone would spend part of each year with Hades in the underworld and part with Demeter in the world above. W4. The exact division varies in different tellings. Some say 4 months below, 8 months above, 1 month for each of the 4 pomegranate seeds. Others say 6 months in each realm, a perfect split between her 2 lives. But regardless of the specific numbers, the pattern was established. And with that pattern came something entirely new to the cosmos, the cycle of seasons. When Persephone is with Demeter, when mother and daughter are reunited, Demeter's joy causes the earth to flourish. This is spring and summer, the time of growth, abundance, fertility, life in its fullest expression. The crops grow tall, the flowers bloom, the trees burst with fruit. The world becomes what it's meant to be when the goddess of the harvest is genuinely, completely happy. But when Persephone must return to the underworld, when mother and daughter are separated once again, Demeter's sorrow causes the earth to wither. This is autumn and winter, the time when leaves fall, crops die back, the land goes dormant, life retreats in the face of cold and darkness. The world becomes what it's like when the goddess of the harvest is mourning. Every year this cycle repeats. Persephone descends, Demeter mourns, the earth dies. Then Persephone returns, Demeter rejoices, the earth blooms again. It's a beautiful explanation for seasonal change, but it's also something much deeper than simple meteorology as mythology. This is a story about how loss becomes part of the fabric of existence itself, about how even the most powerful beings in the cosmos have to learn to live with recurring grief. Because here's what strikes me as most profound about this myth. Demeter never gets over losing Persephone. Every year when her daughter descends to the underworld, Demeter grieves as if it's happening for the first time. She doesn't become numb to it. She doesn't develop coping mechanisms that make the pain more manageable. She doesn't learn to accept the situation in a way that diminishes her sorrow. She mourns, fully, completely, and the world mourns with her. There's something deeply honest about this. How often are we told that we should move on from our losses? That continuing to grieve beyond some arbitrary timeline means we're not healing properly? That acceptance should eventually make the pain go away? Demeter rejects all of that. Every single year, she claims her right to grieve her daughter's absence. She insists that some separations are worth mourning no matter how many times they happen. She refuses to pretend that familiarity with loss makes it hurt any less. And crucially, the world accommodates her sorrow. The cosmos doesn't try to convince her to get over it. Instead, it provides space for her grief, makes room for winter to be what it is, a season of death and dormancy that reflects genuine loss. But, and this is equally important, Demeter also never holds back her joy when Persephone returns. She doesn't protect herself from future pain by diminishing her present happiness. She doesn't say, well, she'll just leave again in a few months, so why bother celebrating? No. Every spring, Demeter's joy is as fresh and powerful as if her daughter had been gone forever and had miraculously returned. She celebrates the reunion fully, completely, with her entire divine essence. And that celebration manifests as spring, as explosive growth, as flowers blooming, as life bursting forth in all its exuberant glory. This is the rhythm that now governs the world: absolute joy in union, absolute sorrow in separation, and the eternal cycle between the two. Neither emotion is diminished by its inevitable end. Neither experience is less real because it will change. Demeter lives fully in each moment, whether that moment is one of togetherness or apartness. And Persephone herself becomes something unique in this arrangement. She is the only major deity who regularly travels between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. She exists in both worlds, belongs fully to neither, or perhaps more accurately, belongs fully to both. In the underworld, she is Hades's queen, ruling over the dead, judging souls, wielding authority in that shadowy realm. She transforms from the maiden picking flowers to the dread queen of the underworld, powerful in her own right, no longer simply a victim of circumstance. But when she returns to the surface, she is once again the maiden of spring, Demeter's beloved daughter, the goddess of growth and renewal. She brings with her the knowledge of death and darkness, but she uses it to make life more precious, growth more miraculous, reunion more meaningful. She is the bridge between realms, the embodiment of the cycle itself. She proves that descent into darkness doesn't have to be permanent, that death isn't necessarily the end, that separation can be followed by reunion. This dual nature, maiden and queen, life and death, above and below, makes Persephone one of the most complex and fascinating figures in all of Greek mythology. She's not just a passive victim rescued by her mother. She's not just a prisoner held captive by an unwanted husband. She's something more nuanced than either of those interpretations. She's a goddess who has experienced violation and adapted to it, who has been forced into a role she didn't choose and found a way to wield power within it, who moves between joy and sorrow, freedom and captivity, presence and absence, and somehow remains herself throughout all these transitions. And her relationship with her mother remains the emotional constant throughout all these changes. No matter how much power she gains in the underworld, no matter how well she adapts to ruling alongside Hades, no matter how complex her identity becomes, when she sees her mother again each spring, she's still Demeter's daughter. The reunions are tender, joyful, filled with genuine love. The separations are sorrowful, difficult, tinged with the knowledge that this will happen again next year and every year after that. But both experiences are real, both are honoured, both are given their full weight and significance. This pattern, this compromise born from tragedy, becomes the template for how ancient Greeks understood time itself. Because before this myth, before this bargain, time was essentially undifferentiated. There was no real distinction between one period and another because everything was always growing, always abundant, always spring-summer. But now, time has texture. It has rhythm. It moves through cycles of growth and dormancy, abundance and scarcity, joy and sorrow. The agricultural year becomes a sacred calendar, each phase tied to the cosmic drama of Demeter and Persephone. Planting season is when Persephone descends, You're putting seeds into the dark earth, just as the maiden descends into the dark underworld. It's an act of faith, trusting that what appears to be burial is actually the beginning of transformation. W. Growing season is the time of waiting, of tending, of hope that the seeds will sprout and the maiden will return. It requires patience and trust in the cycle. Harvest is the celebration of Persephone's return, the joy of reunion manifested in abundant crops. It's thanksgiving for the miracle of growth, for the triumph of life over death. And fallow season winter is the time of Demeter's mourning, when the earth rests and recovers, when nothing grows because the goddess is too grief-stricken to nurture life. But it's also necessary rest, the dormancy that makes future growth possible. This isn't just a cute story to explain why leaves fall in autumn. It's a sophisticated theology of time, suffering, and renewal. It's saying that loss is built into the structure of existence. That separation and reunion are equally real, equally important. That you can't have spring without winter, can't have joy without sorrow, can't have reunion without first experiencing absence. The ancient Greeks who heard this myth understood something profound, that the world itself is grieving and celebrating simultaneously, that the earth beneath their feet was responding to divine emotions, that the food they ate was the product of a mother's love and sorrow. Every harvest was proof that Persephone had returned. Every withering leaf was evidence that she had left again. The entire agricultural year became a reminder of this eternal drama, this compromise that no one involved really wanted, but everyone had learned to live with. And there's something almost revolutionary in how the myth treats this compromise, because it's not presented as a happy ending. It's not portrayed as everything working out perfectly in the end. Persephone is still partially bound to the underworld. Demeter still loses her daughter for part of every year. The violation that started this whole catastrophe is never really undone. What we get instead is accommodation. The world learns to function around an injustice it couldn't fully correct. Demeter learns to survive recurring loss. Persephone learns to navigate two worlds, two identities, two incompatible sets of expectations. It's messy, it's painful, it's not the ending any of them would have chosen if they'd had real choice in the matter. But it's also where hope lives. Because if Persephone can keep returning despite being bound to the underworld, if Demeter's joy can still bloom after repeated separations, if spring can still arrive after every winter, then maybe renewal is always possible. Maybe no darkness is permanent. Maybe no loss is truly final. The seasons became humanity's constant reminder of this truth. Every spring whispered, "See, she came back. She always comes back." Every winter warned, "Yes, but she'll have to leave again. She always leaves again." And in between these extremes, in the actual living of days and years and lives, people learned to plant seeds in sorrow and harvest crops in joy, to endure the cold knowing that warmth would return, to trust in cycles they couldn't control but could witness and honor. That's what the bargain gave the world. Not a perfect solution, but a livable pattern. Not justice, but survival. Not an ending, but an endless cycle of endings and beginnings, deaths and rebirths, separations and reunions that would continue as long as the earth itself endured. And at the center of it all, Demeter's love for Persephone, powerful enough to kill the world or bring it to life, depending on whether that love was honored or violated. The seasons exist because a mother refused to accept her daughter's permanent loss. Winter exists because that mother still grieves every separation. Spring exists because that mother still celebrates every return. The cosmos bent itself around maternal love and never straightened back out. But something profound had been born from all this suffering. Because Demeter's time in Eleusis, her grief transformed into ritual, her personal loss elevated into sacred teaching. This became the foundation of something that would endure for over 1,000 years, something that would become one of the most important spiritual traditions in all of ancient Greece. The Eleusinian Mysteries. Let me ask you something. What would you do if you had experienced what Demeter experienced? If you had lost your child to death, or something worse than death, and then been forced to accept a compromise that meant losing them again and again eternally? Would you just accept that suffering is meaningless? Or would you try to transform it into something that could help others understand their own losses, their own fears, their own relationship with death? As per, Demeter chose transformation. She took her intimate knowledge of loss and reunion, of death and rebirth, of descent and return, and she made it into something sacred, something teachable, something that could offer hope to mortals facing their own mortality. The temple at Eleusis, the one the royal family had built for her, became the center of mysteries that promised initiates a fundamentally different understanding of death. Not death as final ending, but death as transformation, as passage, as part of a cycle that always leads back to renewal. This was revolutionary, because the standard Greek conception of the afterlife was bleak. The underworld was a grey, joyless place where souls wandered as shadows, stripped of everything that made them who they were in life. Death meant becoming a pale imitation of yourself, existing in a state of diminished consciousness for all eternity. But the Eleusinian Mysteries promised something different. They promised that initiated souls would have a privileged existence in the afterlife, that understanding Demeter's mysteries would fundamentally alter what happened to you after death. They promised that death was not the enemy, not the end, but simply part of a greater cycle that mortals could learn to understand and even embrace. The mysteries were based on an agricultural metaphor that would have been immediately obvious to anyone living in ancient Greece. When you plant a seed, you bury it in the earth. To anyone watching, it looks like death. You're putting something in the ground, covering it with soil, removing it from light and air. But that burial is actually the beginning of transformation. The seed breaks open in the darkness. It sends down roots. It pushes up shoots, and eventually it emerges from the earth as something new, something alive, something that will flower and fruit and create more seeds. Persephone's descent into the underworld was like that seed being planted. She disappeared into darkness. She seemed to be lost, dead, gone forever. But her return each spring proved that the descent wasn't final. That darkness leads to light. That death precedes rebirth. This cycle, descent, loss, transformation, return, became the central teaching of the mysteries. The myth of Demeter and Persephone was enacted, experienced, understood not as a distant story about gods, but as a template for what every human soul would experience. The mysteries themselves took place annually in late September or October during the month of Boedromion. They lasted 9 days and involved elaborate rituals that were kept absolutely secret. And I mean absolutely. The penalty for revealing the mysteries was death. People kept these secrets for over 1,000 years, which tells you something about how seriously they took the prohibition. We know the general structure of the festival, but the core rituals, what actually happened in the innermost ceremonies, remain mysterious to this day. Which is kind of beautiful when you think about it. In an age where everything is documented, photographed, live-streamed, there's something powerful about knowledge that remained genuinely secret for over a millennium. What we do know is this. The mysteries were open to almost everyone. Men, women, even slaves could be initiated. The only requirements were that you couldn't have committed murder. You had to be free from blood guilt, and you had to be able to speak Greek. Class didn't matter. Wealth didn't matter. Gender didn't matter. In a highly stratified society where your birth determined almost everything about your life, the mysteries were radically egalitarian. This accessibility was part of their power. Because death comes for everyone regardless of status, the slave and the king both face mortality. The poor and the wealthy both grieve their losses. The mysteries acknowledged this universal human experience and offered wisdom that transcended social boundaries. The festival began in Athens, where sacred objects from Eleusis had been brought to the Eleusinian, a temple at the base of the Acropolis. Initiates called Mysti would gather there for purification rituals. They would bathe in the sea to cleanse themselves. They would make sacrifices. They would fast and prepare themselves mentally and spiritually for what was to come. Then came the procession. The Mysti would walk the 14 miles from Athens to Eleusis along the sacred way, carrying the sacred objects with them. Can you picture it? Thousands of people walking together, probably chanting, probably singing hymns to Demeter, moving as one unified body toward the site where the mysteries would be revealed. They would arrive at night. This timing was intentional. Darkness was essential to the experience. Just as Persephone had descended into the darkness of the underworld, just as seeds are buried in the dark earth, the initiates would enter into darkness as part of their transformation. At Eleusis they would drink the kykeon, a ritual beverage made from barley and water, possibly containing some kind of psychoactive substance. Some scholars speculate it contained ergot, a fungus that grows on grain and contains compounds similar to LSD. Others think the altered states came from fasting, exhaustion, sensory deprivation, and the power of ritual itself, rather than from drugs. However, what we know is that the initiates experienced something profound. The rituals took place in the telesterium, the Hall of Initiation, a massive building that could hold thousands of people. Inside, there were things said logomena, things done dromena, and things shown deiknemena. The climax was called the epoptea, the seeing, a mystical vision or revelation that was considered the ultimate secret. We don't know what was shown, but we know it changed people. One early Christian writer, trying to condemn the mysteries as pagan superstition, let slip one detail, that, at the highest level of initiation, an ear of grain was shown in silence. Just that. An ear of grain held up in the darkness, revealed as the great mystery. And if you think about it, that's perfect. Because what is an ear of grain but the culmination of Demeter's gift? It's proof that what was planted in sorrow has grown into sustenance. It's evidence that the cycle works, that death leads to life, that seeds buried in darkness emerge as food that sustains the world. But there was probably more to the revelation than just the grain. Most scholars believe there was some kind of dramatic reenactment of Demeter and Persephone's story. The separation, the search, the reunion, the descent into darkness and the return to light. The initiates didn't just hear about this cycle, they experienced it. They went through their own symbolic death and rebirth. They entered the telesterion in darkness and fear, perhaps experiencing terrifying visions or enactments. They confronted loss, absence, the terror of mortality. And then, revelation, light, understanding, the promise that death is not the end, that what descends will rise again, that separation is always followed by reunion. Ancient writers who had been initiated spoke about the experience in veiled terms, careful not to reveal the actual secrets, but unable to hide their profound transformation. They said things like, "Blessed is he who has seen these things before going beneath the earth. He knows the end of life and its God-given beginning." The mysteries transformed people's relationship with death, not by promising immortality. The Greeks understood that everyone dies, but by reframing death as part of a meaningful cycle rather than a terrifying end. You're going to die, your loved ones are going to die, loss is inevitable. But look at Persephone, she descended into death and returned. Look at the seed, it's buried and it sprouts. Look at winter, it comes every year, and every year it gives way to spring. This wasn't just comfort, it was cosmology. It was a way of understanding the universe as fundamentally oriented toward renewal rather than toward entropy. Yes, things die, but death isn't the last word, transformation is. The mysteries became enormously popular. Under Pisistratos of Athens in the 6th century BCE, they became pan-Hellenic, open to all Greeks, not just locals. Pilgrims came from all over the Greek world to be initiated. Eventually, even Romans were allowed to participate, and the mysteries continued to flourish under Roman rule. Famous figures were initiated, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, statesmen like Cicero, emperors like Marcus Aurelius. The last pagan Roman emperor Julian was initiated in 361 CE as part of his attempt to revive traditional Greco-Roman religion against the rise of Christianity. The mysteries lasted for over 1,000 years. Think about that. From the Mycenaean period through the classical Greek age, through the Hellenistic period, through Roman rule generation after generation for over a millennium, people came to Eleusis to experience Demeter's mysteries. They were finally closed by Emperor Theodosius I in 392 CE, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire and pagan practices were banned. A few years later, in 396 CE, the Visigoth king Alaric I sacked the sanctuary, and the physical structures were destroyed. The last Hierophant, the high priest who had been initiated by the one commissioned by Julian to restore the mysteries, was apparently a usurper, someone who shouldn't have held the position. And with his death, the unbroken line of tradition going back over 1,000 years was finally severed. But here's what's remarkable. Even after the mysteries ended, even after the sanctuary was destroyed, even after Christianity suppressed pagan practices, the secrets remained secrets. No one ever revealed exactly what happened in the Telesterion. No one ever published a tell-all scroll detailing the core rituals. Thousands of people over hundreds of years kept the secret. They took their knowledge to their graves. They honoured their oaths of silence even when there was no institution left to enforce those oaths. That tells you something about the power of what they experienced, that it was worth protecting, that it was too sacred to profane by speaking about it carelessly. What we're left with is the framework, the structure, the mythology that surrounded the mysteries. We know they were about Demeter and Persephone. We know they dealt with themes of death, loss, transformation, and renewal. We know they involved agricultural symbolism, grain, seeds, the cycle of seasons. We know they promised a better afterlife to initiates. Not heaven in the Christian sense, but something more nuanced, a privileged place in the underworld, a better quality of existence after death, perhaps even the ability to be reborn. And we know they were founded by Demeter herself, at least according to the mythology. That in her time of greatest suffering, when she was grieving her daughter in Eleusis, she established these sacred rites as a gift to humanity. It's a fitting legacy, because what are the mysteries but Demeter taking her personal tragedy and transforming it into collective wisdom? She experienced loss that nearly destroyed the world. She learned that some separations are inevitable, that love means accepting recurring grief, that joy and sorrow are both real and both eternal. And she taught mortals how to face their own losses with that same knowledge, how to see death not as a final enemy, but as part of a cycle. how to grieve fully without losing hope, how to trust that what descends will rise again. The mysteries were Demeter's gift to humanity, a gift born from her darkest moment, forged in her grief, and offered to help others navigate their own darkness. They lasted over 1,000 years because they addressed something fundamental in the human experience: the fear of death, the pain of loss, the desperate need to believe that separation isn't final. And at the center of it all was a mother's love for her daughter, a love so powerful it could kill the world or resurrect it, a love that transformed personal suffering into universal wisdom, a love that insisted death was not the end of the story. That's what the Eleusinian Mysteries were, not just rituals, not just traditions, but the ongoing echo of Demeter's grief and joy, teaching generation after generation that winter always gives way to spring, that seeds buried in darkness always find their way toward light, that reunion follows separation as surely as dawn follows night. And so we arrive at the heart of what Demeter truly is. Not just a goddess who had a dramatic story, not just the explanation for why seasons change, but something more fundamental, more enduring, more essential to the fabric of existence itself. Demeter is the eternal nurturer, the constant presence that makes life possible, the benevolent yet formidable force that governs the most basic necessity of all living things, sustenance. After everything, after the abduction, after the grief, after the compromise that split her daughter between two worlds, Demeter continued her work. She didn't abandon humanity despite their god's betrayal. She didn't withdraw her blessings permanently despite having every right to. Instead, she settled into a rhythm that would define the rest of time. When Persephone is with her, when mother and daughter are reunited, Demeter pours her joy into the earth. Spring arrives with explosive abundance, summer follows with sustained growth. The fields produce grain, the orchards bear fruit, the gardens overflow with vegetables. Every year this abundance is her gift to a world that she could have abandoned but chose to nurture instead. And when Persephone must return to the underworld, when the separation comes as it always does, Demeter's sorrow manifests as autumn and winter. But even in this mourning, even in this withdrawal, she's teaching something important. She's showing that rest is necessary, that dormancy prepares for growth, that the fallow season is not death, but preparation for renewal. The ancient Greeks understood this deeply. They knew that Demeter wasn't just some distant deity to be acknowledged in festivals. She was present in their daily lives in the most immediate, tangible way possible. Every meal was her gift. Every loaf of bread was made from grain that grew because of her blessing. Every harvest was proof of her continued care for humanity. They called bread the gift of Demeter, not poetically, but literally. When you ate, you were consuming her benevolence, her power, her ongoing commitment to sustaining life. The most basic act of survival eating was a direct connection to this goddess. Sir. This made Demeter unique among the Olympians. Zeus might rule from his throne, hurling lightning when he was displeased. Poseidon might command the seas, creating storms and earthquakes. Athena might guide warriors in battle, Aphrodite might inspire passion, but none of them were present in daily life the way Demeter was. You could live your entire life without encountering Zeus's lightning or Poseidon's storms. You could avoid warfare and ignore passion, but you could not live without eating. You could not survive without the harvest. Demeter was the goddess you needed, not just wanted. The deity whose blessings determined whether your children would live or die, whether your community would thrive or starve. This gave her a kind of power that was quieter than Zeus's thunder, but ultimately more fundamental. She was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Without her cooperation, without her blessing, all of civilization collapsed. The gods themselves had learned this during her withdrawal after Persephone's abduction. Without mortal worship, without human offerings, the Olympians' relevance diminished. And mortal worship depended on mortals being alive, which depended on Demeter. So she continued her work, season after season, year after year, century after century. She presided over the cycles of planting and harvest. She blessed the farmers who tended their fields. She ensured that seeds sprouted, that crops grew, that humanity could continue to feed itself. But her role extended beyond just making things grow. She was also the guardian of sacred law, of the social order that agriculture made possible. Remember, farming requires community. It requires agreements about who owns which land, when harvests happen, how resources are distributed. You can't have agriculture without some form of civilization, some structure of law and custom. Demeter, as the goddess who taught humanity agriculture, was also the goddess who taught them how to live together in organized societies. She was called Themophoros, the lawgiver, because her gifts came with responsibilities, with rules, with the necessity of maintaining social order. This is why women celebrated the Themophoria in her honor, a fertility festival that was about more than just crops. It was about the continuation of communities, about the sacred work of maintaining life in all its forms, about ensuring that future generations would have the food and social structures they needed to survive. Ancient Greeks held festivals throughout the agricultural year, each one marking a different phase of Demeter's ongoing relationship with humanity. There were rituals for planting, for the first shoots appearing, for the grain ripening, for the harvest itself. And of course, there were the Eleusinian Mysteries, which elevated Demeter's story into profound spiritual teaching. But beyond these grand festivals, there were daily acts of worship. Farmers would make small offerings before planting. Households would dedicate the first portion of their harvest to the goddess. Mothers would pray to her for their children's nourishment. She was woven into the fabric of everyday life in a way that few other deities could match. And she was both benevolent and formidable. This balance is crucial to understanding Demeter. She was called the good goddess because of her generosity, her nurturing nature, her willingness to sustain humanity despite everything she'd suffered. When she was pleased, when she was honored properly, her blessings flowed freely. But she was also dangerous when crossed. The story of Erisichthon, the man who cut down her sacred grove and was cursed with insatiable hunger, was a warning. Respect the goddess, honor the earth, maintain the sacred balance, or face consequences that no amount of wealth or power could alleviate. This wasn't capriciousness. Demeter didn't punish people for arbitrary reasons, but she demanded respect for the natural world, for the cycles that sustained life, for the sacred trust that existed between humanity and the earth. Violate that trust, and you'd learn exactly how much you depended on her continued goodwill. In ancient art, Demeter was typically portrayed as a mature woman, not a young maiden, not an ancient crone, but someone in the fullness of life and power. She wore a crown or wreath made of wheat stalks. She carried sheaves of grain. Sometimes she held a cornucopia overflowing with fruits and vegetables. And often she carried torches, a reminder of her search for Persephone, yes, but also a symbol of illumination, of knowledge, of the wisdom she offered to those who honored her mysteries. The symbols were simple but profound. Wheat and grain, the most basic food that sustained civilization. The cornucopia, abundance, generosity, the promise that if you honored the earth properly, it would provide more than enough. The torchlight in darkness, hope in despair, knowledge that transforms fear into understanding. Pigs and snakes were sacred to her. pigs because they were closely associated with agriculture, fed on grain and representing the cycle of life and death. Snakes because they lived in the earth, because they shed their skin and renewed themselves, because they represented both danger and transformation. But beyond all the symbols and festivals and myths, what Demeter truly represented was this: the ongoing work of sustaining life, the patience required to plant seeds and wait for growth, the hope that allows you to bury grain in the earth trusting it will sprout, the rhythm of seasons that teaches you about endings and beginnings, about loss and return, about grief and joy. Jessie embodied the cycle of life, death, and renewal, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. Every year, plants died in autumn and were reborn in spring. Every harvest season, grain was cut down so that it could become food. Seeds from one generation became plants in the next. Death wasn't the opposite of life, it was part of life's continuation. This is what the Eleusinian Mysteries taught, but it's also what every farmer understood from working the land. Demeter's wisdom was available to anyone who paid attention to the earth's cycles. You didn't need initiation into secret rites to understand that winter always gives way to spring, that seeds planted in faith produce sustenance, that what seems like death is often just transformation. Demeter the eternal nurturer, Demeter the patient teacher, Demeter the fierce protector, Demeter the grieving mother, Demeter the joyful celebrant of reunion. She was all of these things simultaneously, and she continues to be all of them in every cycle of seasons, in every harvest, in every moment when death gives way to new life. The ancient Greeks are gone, their temples are ruins. The Eleusinian Mysteries ended over 1600 years ago, but the cycles Demeter governs continue. Spring still arrives after winter, seeds still sprout from dark earth, grain still grows and feeds humanity. The cycle of life, death, and renewal continues exactly as she established it. In that sense, Demeter is perhaps the most enduring of all the Greek deities, not because people worship her anymore, though some neo-pagans have revived her veneration, but because what she represents is timeless and universal. Every agricultural society has understood the truth she embodies, that life depends on the earth's fertility, that growth requires patience and care, that loss and abundance are both part of existence, that the cycle always continues. Modern industrial agriculture might seem to have moved beyond dependence on Demeter's blessings. We have fertilizers and pesticides and genetic modification. We've mechanized and optimized and calculated every aspect of food production. But the fundamental truth remains. Plants still need to grow. Grain still needs to be cultivated. The earth still needs to be fertile. We might not pray to Demeter anymore, but we're still entirely dependent on the processes she symbolizes. And perhaps we've forgotten some of what she taught, about respecting the earth, about maintaining balance, about understanding agriculture as sacred trust rather than extractive industry. The ancient Greeks knew that Demeter's blessings could be withdrawn if the sacred relationship between humanity and earth was violated. We're learning that lesson again the hard way through soil depletion and climate change and ecological collapse. A Demeter's story reminds us that some relationships are too important to betray, that the earth's fertility is not infinite or unconditional, that we depend on natural cycles we didn't create and can't fully control. That being the supposedly dominant species doesn't exempt us from consequences when we violate the fundamental systems that sustain life. But her story also offers hope. Because if Demeter can continue to bless the earth despite her own grief, despite the cosmic injustice done to her and her daughter, despite having every reason to abandon humanity, then renewal is always possible. If spring can return after every winter, if seeds can sprout after being buried in darkness, if Persephone can emerge from the underworld year after year, then transformation is always within reach. Demeter teaches patience. She teaches that some things cannot be rushed, that growth happens in its own time, that you plant seeds in one season and harvest in another. She teaches resilience, that you can experience devastating loss and still find ways to nurture, to create, to sustain life. She teaches that grief and joy are not opposites, but dance partners in an eternal cycle. She teaches that power isn't always loud, that the most essential forces are often the quietest, that the hand that plants seeds and the hand that brings in the harvest wield more real power than the hand that throws lightning bolts. She teaches that nurturing is not weakness but the ultimate strength, the force that sustains everything else, the foundation without which nothing can exist. More. And she remains, season after season, the eternal nurturer who makes all life possible. The goddess of the harvest who taught humanity how to feed itself, the grieving mother whose sorrow creates winter, the joyful mother whose happiness creates spring, the fierce protector who demands respect for the earth, the patient teacher who shows us that death is not the end of the cycle, but part of its continuation. Demeter the essential, Demeter the enduring, Demeter the eternal. As long as seeds are planted and harvests gathered, as long as winter gives way to spring, as long as the cycle of life continues, Demeter's presence endures. Not as a figure from ancient mythology that we've moved beyond, but as a reminder of fundamental truths we ignore at our peril, that life depends on the earth's fertility, that some losses recur eternally, that renewal always follows death, that what we plant we eventually harvest, and that the most essential power in all of existence is the power to nurture life itself. That is Demeter's legacy. That is her eternal role. That is why, among all the gods and goddesses of Olympus, she remains perhaps the most relevant, the most necessary, the most worthy of our attention and respect. The goddess of the harvest, presiding over the endless cycle of death and rebirth, loss and return, winter and spring, forever.